If you've been playing and discussing these games for a while like me, then you've probably noticed a pretty universal constant when it comes to discussion. Out of all the games in the Persona series, Persona 1 is not only the least talked about, not only is it the least favored, it is also probably the least played among the modern fandom. Even with really long-running RPG series like Final Fantasy, plenty of ways to experience the game where it started it all have been released to the public over the years. Funnily enough, that wasn't always the case though. Persona 1 was a major success for Atlus on its initial release. In many cases, the first entry in a popular series of games tends to be pretty well appreciated throughout time, even in spite of its aged and dated gameplay. The same cannot be said of Persona 1. Persona 1's popularity has dwindled greatly over the years. If anything, people give the honorary veteran status to Persona 2 way more. So on a bit of a whim, I kind of felt the urge to revisit this game and talk about some of the things I just mentioned, as well as the game itself, of course. Is the game overhated, or is it really bad enough to warrant avoiding it like the plague? Or that thing from 3 years ago? Oh boy, here it is. The first Persona game. Let's see what this game entails. So anyways, this is why I dropped Revelations Persona. Alright, so at this point, it's no secret that the PS1 version of Persona 1 is pretty infamous for a number of reasons. All of them in tandem ultimately make the original English release obsolete, with most people's preferred version of the game being the PSP version, the game I actually played to completion for this video. We'll get to that later though. Skip to this timestamp if you just want to jump straight into it. For now, let's get all the surface level stuff out of the way first. Megami Ibunroku Persona was localized in the West as Revelations Persona. The most obvious thing you'll notice about Revelations is the localization changes. They removed almost any and all traces of Japanese anything, and gave all the characters generic English names. Almost. The first thing you might think of when you hear this is probably something akin to a 4Kids dub. I assure you though, this goes beyond that. At least 4Kids didn't straight up alter the races of certain characters. But by far, the biggest botch of this English localization has got to be the removal of a whole alternate story path from the game. There are plenty of theories as to why they did this, like wanting to get the game out immediately for holiday season, a stiff budget, and understaffing, etc. Either way, there is no denying that Revelations Persona is an incomplete game. That alone makes the PSP version more enticing. But trust me, there are way better reasons to play the PSP version instead. I played about 5.5 hours of Revelations for the sake of having footage of it, and I have some things to say about it. Bro, if you want to bitch and moan about style over substance, look no further than Revelations Persona. This game is the textbook definition of that. Sure, on a surface level, the game's visual and audio design looks way more representative of its time period, and may even make it seem more enticing to play for the authentic experience. Once you actually play the game though, you realize that those are basically the only things this version of the game really has. I was originally going to play both the PS1 and PSP versions of this game for the video, but I decided pretty early on to drop that idea. The biggest factor in this has got to be the game's abysmal speed, or lack thereof I should say. Battles go at the speed of molasses. Look, Jack Frost's ice breath attack is cute and all, but when you're fighting 4 of them at once, it gets really grating really fast. But by far, the worst offender of them all has got to be the stupid gremlin's happy dance. Hey guys, I'm back from my long hiatus. Sorry for being gone for so long. I just graduated with my degree and... Oh, the fight's still going? I need you to keep in mind that these are just regular encounters. Sure, people complain about encounter rates in a lot of RPGs, but at least in all the good ones, battles had a good pace and a satisfying flow to them. Attack animations packed a punch but weren't too drawn out. And you want to know the worst part? Revelations Persona has a lower encounter rate than the original Japanese version. Dude, I don't even want to know what playing Megami Ibunroku must be like. Now, supposedly, the encounter rate was lowered in Revelations to make the game easier, but I don't think that's the case. Normal encounters are already easy as shit either way. I think they did it just so you wouldn't have to sit through those long-ass animations nearly as much. I'm sure they knew. I hear some people complain about how the UI and menus were ruined in the PSP version, and look boring every now and then. Well, I agree the more mechanical looking interface and seeing or hearing things snap into place is very satisfying. But that literally means nothing when the menus feel really awkward to navigate, and there's basically no feedback whenever a magic spell is ineffective. They make it pretty obvious when it hits, or when it reflects, but not when the enemy is immune. It shows nothing regardless of whether it misses or the enemy straight up blocks it. How am I supposed to know the difference? It indicates when a regular physical attack misses. If I see a spell not land, I assume it must not work and move on to something else. But then later on, I see gameplay footage of people using the exact same attacks and it turns out the enemies were vulnerable to it? Get out of here. Just look up a guide, bro. It's an old game. Just look up a guide. I look at guides when I don't know where the hell to go or how a mechanic quite works, not because the game can't communicate basic feedback like every other RPG. And lastly, the translation. I don't hold it against the translating team for all the typos and weird phrasing in some of these lines. I really don't. It's pretty funny a lot of the time, and if Persona 1 were just some silly little game, then I'd be completely fine with that, not even worth discussing further. However, it makes it really hard to take the game seriously, or take any of the people who say that Persona 1 is more mature than the modern game seriously. Nate Trinity just straight up wants his friends to die. He's beyond unhinged. Really, if you want to play the PS1 version of Persona 1 in English that badly, I would honestly just wait for the fan translation being worked on by translator Tom. There's a delocalization patch of Revelations as well, whatever floats your boat really. Also, Reiji, aka Chris, is supposed to be this intimidating tough guy, like probably steals your lunch money type beat. But then they made him sound like this. He sounds more like the guy who's getting his lunch stolen. I can enjoy it for being funny, but not much else. The world map also did not have to be this big. It really didn't. Most overworld real estate, in my experience, is much better utilized. I seriously doubt the game really needed it to take 10 minutes to walk from school to the hospital. It's just like real life. Man, forget what I said about Persona 3 being the most organic. This is true immersion right here. Yeah, I'll gladly take the PSP world map any day, even if it's not great. But you know, despite my harsh words, I do kinda sorta almost see a little bit of the appeal in all of this. Revelations Persona is a very visually and auditorily appealing game. It's a very purely aesthetic type of game that's meant to carry you away in the atmosphere. You don't play Revelations Persona to play a game, you play it just to look at it and watch. It's something you use as background footage for your Vaporwave compilation. Unfortunately, that can only take you so far. There are more fun retro RPGs to play and use for aesthetic appeal. In conclusion, Persona 1 is all style and no substance. So anyways, onto the real video. The biggest reason people seem to avoid Persona 1 altogether is because of the gameplay. It's very much dreaded by a large amount of the fanbase from my understanding. I first played this game in 2020 right after beating Persona 5 Royal for the biggest possible whiplash in quality as possible. And yet, I just did not find it as abhorrent as many people exclaim online about. Now to be clear, I have my criticisms of the game. I plan to get into all of those later in this video, but the way people described the gameplay to me before I actually played Persona 1 made it sound almost unplayable. Well, I can assure you right here and now that Persona 1 is completely playable. It's a pretty easy game all things considered. That along with the game's short length make it an overall pretty inoffensive experience. The battle animations in the PSP version are much more reasonable, and even then you can speed up the animations by pressing start. Battles are a lot more snappy and less of a bother here than in Revelations. It's more like your run-of-the-mill JRPG than you might initially think. You roam around a world map with transitionary areas that allow access to other parts of the world map to access other areas to progress the story and shit, blah blah, this is nothing new. The dungeon crawling experience is all first person, just like most Mega 10 games at the time. The dungeons aren't overly complicated or anything like that, they're pretty straightforward. In fact, I'd argue the dungeons in this game are less complicated than most of the Mega 10 games before it, the only exception to this being the final dungeon of the Snow Queen route. Thankfully, there are maps of it online. If you want to skip out on most of the exploration and just head straight for the end, follow the blue arrow. Just be warned though, following a map for these first-person dungeon crawlers is pretty awkward. You basically face north the entire time to keep your map oriented in the right direction, and sidestep or moonwalk your way to the staircase. It's pretty amusing to watch back though. In fact, I'd argue the Snow Queen route has the most interesting dungeons in the game. Maybe not so much layout-wise, but conceptually. So in a nutshell, the Snow Queen route's progression is structured much differently than Sebek's progression. There's no overworld exploration, and you are able to do the dungeons in any order you want. There are 3 towers, Hypnos, Nemesis, and Thanatos Tower respectively. Each dungeon has its own gimmick. Hell, 2 of them have their own little sub-dungeon on one of their floors. What I like about the 3 towers of Snow Queen is how they encourage exploration a lot more than the main story dungeons. In the Sebek dungeons, you don't really get much out of exploring places you didn't have to be aside from treasure and a few lines of optional dialogue for your party members. There's definitely more to be gained in Snow Queen, but there is also something to be lost as well. These dungeons have a time limit, so you don't want to dawdle for too long. At the same time though, exploring more could reward you with mirror shards. You need at least 8 of them to get the good ending, and 12 to get the sorta best sword and set of armor in the game, but not really. They can be scattered throughout the dungeon, as well as locked behind doing certain things in said dungeon, such as entering the Dream World in Hypnos Tower to wake up your friends. In the case of Nemesis Tower, however, exploring further in the interest of finding another mirror shard and a hint on how to defeat the boss will actually end up costing you more than just taking the shorter route, which will actually shorten the length of your friend's torture. Finally, there's Thanatos Tower. It easily has the most generous time limit, but the most brutal gimmick. Characters who die in battle will lose their persona. This basically makes them sitting ducks, and the only way to reclaim their persona is to enter Tartarus on the 2nd floor. Having characters die too often means needing to revisit here more often, and using up more of your precious time. It might be a bit too brutal if you plan to do this tower first, but I don't hate it by any means. The boss is actually pretty fun with an underleveled party. I still beat the boss on my first try with magical guards stacked in my inventory. Between the 2 scenarios, I'd say I enjoy Snow Queen more. Hell, the whole idea of having an alternate story path is really interesting to me, and I would honestly love to see something like this again in the series someday. I don't even really mind the amount of steps you need to take to initiate Snow Queen. Having little secrets like this in video games is cool, even if they're not so secret anymore with the prevalence of the internet nowadays. I don't know, something about the fact that you, yourself, have to investigate rumors about the Snow Queen theatrical play, and go out of your way to unleash a curse onto your whole school. All this happened just because of your morbid curiosity. The same can kind of be said about the way you acquire the secret party member on the main scenario, but that one's a little bit too convoluted. Snow Queen is basically all done right on your second visit to the school. Recruiting Reiji Kido into your party not only requires a bunch of scattered flags across the first couple hours of the game, but one of them involves talking to his mother. Only talk to her once though. If you talk to her a second time, you screw up the whole thing. What a weird way to set up an optional party member. It's stuff like this though that really makes this game stand out from the others though. I gotta hand it to them. Speaking of its subtle charms, I think another huge service to this game is the aesthetic. I talked a bit about the UI and sound effects before, but now I'd like to go a bit broader. Back in the 90s, the first game that came to your mind when someone said modern setting RPG was probably Earthbound. While the Mother series games were definitely more modern, it definitely made a lot more parallels to fantasy RPGs than Megami Tensei did. PSI is your equivalent to magic, bats were your equivalent to swords, burgers were your potions, etc. It seems really methodical and leans way more on the surreal and science fiction side of things. Megami Tensei, on the other hand, allowed straight-up magic and advanced technology to coexist very casually. But what did Persona do that made it different from the rest of Megami Tensei? Well, two things. One of them was something done as a follow-up to the response of Shin Megami Tensei If. Not even so much the game itself, but rather the good reception of SMT If's high school setting. I don't know if it's just me, but for some reason, I find the high school setting very ideal for occult-type stories. Maybe it's just because I played a lot of RPG Maker horror games in high school, but just the setup of a bunch of students doing a little ritual based on some rumor they heard feels so befitting. The idea of personas may have loosely been derived from the Guardian mechanic of If as well, but they function pretty differently and are conceptually pretty different as well. Especially given the very blatantly Jungian origins of personas. In fact, this game probably has the most Jungian imagery of all the Persona games. It's extremely obvious even to a layman like myself. Jungian psychology is more philosophy than psychology from what I've been told. To me, it all sounds like a fever dream, and so do most retro game vaporwave compilations. A match made in heaven for this game. This game definitely gets all the main points of Jungian thought across. It's all about introspection. You are you. That includes your negative aspects. We all put on different faces for different places, and thus our decision making may not always be consistent. The game gives you multiple chances to do either the selfish thing or the selfless thing to do. And not everyone will always pick the former nor the latter. At the end of the day, you gotta learn to love yourself, or maybe put in the work to become the self you want to love. That's what this series is all about, ain't it? While we're on the topic of artistic direction, let's address the music. This tends to be another point of contention. Really, if we were given the option to choose between the original and PSP soundtrack, people probably wouldn't be making as big a deal out of it. People get really heated with their platitudes of artistic vision and what fits the mood of the game. You know Shoji Meguro worked on the original soundtrack, right? He wasn't the lead composer, but he knows what the original music sounded like. What, you don't think he knew the original author's intent? Of course he did. Doesn't fit the mood? I think he knows what the mood is supposed to be. I'm sure he had it in mind when composing the new music, but just wanted a different approach. Shit's extremely subjective, so saying one soundtrack or the other is unbefitting is basically saying nothing. Personally, I like the PS1 soundtrack better. Not only do I like the songs better, but there's also a wider variety of tracks, like every main cast character having their own theme. One thing you can't go 2 seconds without hearing about this game's music is how the boss theme doesn't truly begin until you input the first command. But by far, my favorite track in this game has got to be the Persona Awakening theme. No better music has ever been used for any Awakening scene since. No cap. Imagine a Persona 5 Awakening with this track. Actually, you know what? Never mind. I'll just show you.
You made me wait quite a while. You seek power, correct? Then let us form a pact. Since your name has been disgraced already, why not hoist the flag and wreak havoc? The other you who exists within desires it thus. I am thou, thou art I. There is no turning back. The skull of rebellion is your flag henceforth!
Right on. What's up, Persona? This effing rocks! Now that I got this power, it's time for payback! Yo, I'm ready. Bring it!
I will say though, the PSP version does have a few good tracks. I know I just praised the PS1 boss theme, but Bloody Destiny works well in its own right. The start of the track has a very sinister, but not too serious tone to it. Kind of like facing off with a Saturday morning cartoon villain of the week. Yes, I did just compare Persona 1 villains to cartoon villains. The first one you fight is literally just the main villain's lackey, and the majority of the rest of them are just demons. But then, after some build-up, it turns up the intensity to maximum. You know, I don't even really care to get into the minutiae of describing the differences between the soundtracks. Honestly, just pick one, it's not that deep. If you've watched my best versions of Persona video, you'll know I find people who ultra shill for certain mods really annoying. Well, there's a mod that actually restores a pretty good amount of the PS1 soundtrack to the PSP version, including the ones that don't even have equivalents to replace in the PSP soundtrack, with it only having half the number of songs and all. I think it's a really good mod, and I personally used it myself while replaying the game. But you know what? I feel really fucking bad for people just trying to play the PSP version as it is, getting their ear chewed off about how much better the PS1 soundtrack is. I don't know, when it comes to these types of mods, sometimes it just doesn't cross people's minds to use them, and sometimes they just don't need them? I know, it's crazy, right? That's why I chose not to take into account any mods for that old video. Sure, a music restoration mod is pretty harmless and not really game altering like adding direct commands to Persona 3, but at the end of the day, I'd rather just sell people on the game, not the supplemental stuff. The mods are there for people who want it. I'm just not really a fan of annoying mod salesmen. Can anyone relate?
I told you he was on to us.
You know what else people love to shove down your throat a lot? The manga. Now, I've never read the Persona 1 manga, so I obviously have nothing against it. I gotta be real with you though. I really don't like the idea of people conflating the manga with the game experience or using the manga as a substitute for the game. Firstly, it boils down the value of a Persona experience to just its story, which I hate. It pisses me off when people did it with the Persona 3 movies, and it pisses me off with Persona 1 as well. Secondly, there's a reason these different mediums exist to begin with. Playing a game is different from reading a book or watching a movie. Games are an interactive experience. The player is actively involved in the climactic battles. It's the journey, not the destination. Sure, maybe the manga does expand on the story more, or maybe you might like the way the story is told better in the manga. You might not be interested in playing Persona 1 at all. That's completely fine. But at the end of the day, the game and the manga are not the same thing. They are not interchangeable, so don't treat it that way. Don't go around saying, oh, I played all the Persona games when you've only really played 4 and 5, but binged a cutscene compilation of 2, watched the Persona 3 movies, and read the Persona 1 manga. I'm not saying you can't do that, I'm just saying it's not the same thing as playing all the games. Mixing and matching ain't a crime. You can wear your socks with your Crocs, but I personally feel that experiencing the entire series within the same medium is not only a more cohesive experience, it also shows the evolution the series went through more clearly, and this has greatly increased my appreciation for the series as a whole. And yes, I can say that even despite my criticisms for this game. I know I've been defending this game a lot, and I stand by what I say, but if you thought this video was going to be me touting this game as some sort of underrated masterpiece, or how this game is so persecuted, you got another thing coming.
もしも僕が悪魔でも友達でいてくれますか
悪魔、青春、RPG、ペルソナ、アトラス。
While the gameplay isn't as intolerable as people like to make it out to be, it definitely makes a lot of odd decisions. It seems to want to experiment with a myriad of things, but barely even dips its toes into any of them. At first glance, it seems like Persona 1's gameplay has a lot of moving parts to it. You would think the grid system would require a bit more thought than the simple row system of other games at the time. But it actually requires about the same amount. It's effectively the same thing. The limitations of the grid basically make it so that certain weapons and skills only have a set range and area of effect. In practice though, this really only affects physical attacks, those being your melee attack, gun attack, and physical skills. In fact, quite a lot of physical skills in this game have such tiny ranges that they're usually not worth using at all unless the enemies are just straight up immune to magic. Magic, on the other hand, has basically no range limit. The only difference is the number of targets the spells hit. Some are single target attacks, some have an area of effect, and some of them just hit all enemies. They easily have the least limitation, so obviously that just makes magic the go-to in most situations. The only real stipulation to this is that sometimes you might have too much range sometimes. Spells like Agidyne, Bufudyne, and Zeodyne are not single target spells like you would assume based on the convention set by the previous tier spells. They actually have a slightly wider area of effect. This means if you're in a group of enemies where the enemy weak to your spell is right next to the enemy that repels it, you're just gonna have to bite the bullet. At least, that's what I thought at first. Demons immune to magic are probably just not worth fighting at all at that point, so just remove them from the battle by talking to them. Then kill off the remaining ones. Party positions are also something that I put little to no thought into. Maki goes all the way in the back because she can't hit shit up close. Most other characters don't require too much thought though. Even other characters with long-range capabilities can be kept pretty close to the front, since unlike Maki's bow, they aren't stifled by being close up. The only real limitation at that point is that characters can't be right next to each other, requiring at least one tile of breathing room. Basically just Final Fantasy IV's row system at that point. 3 in the front, 2 in the back, or vice versa. Another mechanic that just kinda feels like bloat is the way demon negotiation was handled, or demon contact as it's called in this game. Demons have different personality traits. They can have a number of different combinations and react differently to different characters and different contact skills. There are 4 different moods you can put the enemy in, but really the only one that matters is eagerness. On paper, this sounds like an interesting system. It allows every character to show off a little bit of their personality, but then they just had to add a bunch of factors that attempt to add depth, but effectively just do the opposite. So you'll notice that some actions won't always have the same reaction every time. And yeah, that's completely intentional. Even if you look up a contact guide, you'll notice some contact actions can result in multiple reactions. In my experience, doing something to push the demon a little towards happy first might make your next action more likely to get eager, but that might just be placebo. Also, every character has 4 different contact skills, so in battle that means there are 20 different contact options to experiment with. There's also the moon phase, which might also affect demon behavior during contact. So this boils down most demon interactions to either using the same contact skill over and over again, or just straight up none of them working. That's just with the party members you have. You straight up can't get the card of some demons unless you have a specific character. If you don't have Nanjo in your party, or he's just dead, your ass is not getting Gary McCullough's card. In this game, you have a select number of mandatory party members. In the main Sebek route, you're stuck with Maki, Nanjo, and Mark, with one other character of your choice. In the alternate Snow Queen route, Yukino and Ayase are your default party members, with 2 other characters of your choice. Some characters are only available in one route or the other. Whoever you pick, you're stuck with. Don't be that guy who recruits Brown on your first playthrough because he offered first. Trust me, that guy was me. But enough of that, let's talk about the titular personas. You don't actually negotiate for the demons themselves in this game, and they don't immediately join your stock as a persona like in Persona 5. You get the demon's spell card. You can't actually use them as a persona, you can only fuse them into personas. Likewise, actual personas cannot be fused, only used. Alright, you see all those stats in the bottom left right there? Ignore those completely. If you've been dumping all of your main character's points into agility, you're good. Any stat of yours that's higher than your personas will be virtually unaffected. Any stat that's lower than your personas will simply scale up. The only thing you should care about on this status screen is the persona's magic attack stat. If your persona just happens to have good skills, so much the better. Most personas in the game have pretty underwhelming skill sets. That doesn't matter though, because you can just buy spell rocks and use them as a fusion item to teach them better skills. It gets even more insane in Snow Queen. If you farm coins at the casino, you can get even better spell rocks. You can straight up give all of your personas Megidolon. You might be thinking, what about those resistances? Should I pay attention to those? Kind of. Resistances aren't really make or break. The only thing you really need to worry about are weaknesses. Oh yeah, you wanna know something else? It doesn't even list all of your resistances and weaknesses here. You'll notice that a persona has a type and a subtype, and these come with implicit resistances and weaknesses that aren't listed below. It's so funny how much information they're dumping on you in this status screen, but most of it doesn't even matter. And all of these things become most apparent once you reach the final dungeon in both scenarios. Most of the game is pretty easy, and you can manage without grinding. But then the enemy levels just shoot up rapidly at the end of the game. Even as you progress through the last dungeon, the curve gets steep. This is the one and only point in the game where you will probably find yourself grinding. I don't even hate grinding like a lot of other people do. Grinding in certain games can be relaxing and, dare I say, even a little fun if it's spread out into shorter sessions throughout the game. In this game, the grind is backloaded and is basically relegated to this one point in the game. And instead of helping the player appreciate the mechanics more by experimenting, you just kind of realize how little difference it makes in Persona 1's case. What's worse is how the game handles XP distribution. There's this weird priority system where the character that pulls the most weight gets the most XP. This doesn't sound bad at first, but then you start to realize that basically whoever has the strongest skills and acts sooner will kill the most enemies and thus always get the most XP most of the time. This almost certainly guarantees that your main character will be well above everyone else, and at least one character is always going to be way behind. There's only so much of the best stuff to go around after all. The last couple things I want to mention on the grinding side of things are your Persona level and Persona rank. In most Mega 10 games, your level is the cap for how strong the demons you can recruit and fuse can be. Makes sense, right? Well, in Persona 1, you not only gain regular experience for your character, but you also gain Persona experience for your Persona level. This is the determining factor for whether you can fuse or equip a Persona or not. You want to know the check for receiving a spell card from a demon contact is? The average of your party's character levels, not Persona levels. Then there's your Persona rank. Every time you fuse a new Persona, they start at rank 1 with only one initial skill. They gain more of their skills and increase their stats as the rank increases. So if you're not using spell rocks to get good skills as early as rank 2, you have to rank a Persona pretty high before they can even become useful. Yeah, screw that, spell rocks are king. It's not even so much that the things I mentioned make the game worse. The point I'm trying to make is that these things don't add anything. It feels like a bunch of ideas that were implemented without actually putting much thought into how they would work. It's one thing to experiment with new things and test the waters, but there's no value in those design choices unless it provides meaningful decision making on the player's part. For example, let's take a look at Soul Hackers. Bro, more thought was put into the demon loyalty system than any of Persona 1's mechanics. At least Soul Hackers had pretty consistent rhyme and reason behind demon behavior, what skills they favored, and ways to manipulate it. Some of Persona 1's mechanics can be ignored completely unnoticed, even when they are in effect. Some mechanics like the grid end up being self-defeating. And then you have stuff like spell rocks completely trivializing fusion and devaluing any little sense of variety that comes with fusion. You don't fuse for the Persona itself, you fuse for that magic attack stat and the one spell you want to teach it. In terms of variety, I'd say the original Pokemon games for the Game Boy were better on that front. Each monster felt different enough from each other in terms of stats and move pool to where it actually felt like it made a difference which ones you chose for your team. Sure, you could give Pokemon really good moves like in Persona 1, but there were more limitations to what moves could be taught to whom. At the end of the day though, do these oversights make the game unfun? No, they just make me think how much more fun it could have been if they planned a lot of these things more thoroughly. As I stated earlier, the game is effectively about as playable as any average JRPG. Despite my criticisms of it, I did still enjoy the game just fine when I first played it. I think this is just a matter of hindsight being 20/20. Usually with other JRPGs, I'll learn new things and try to change up my playstyle on replays, and that's a huge part of the fun for me. In the case of Persona 1, the more I really looked into it, the more conflicted I started to feel. Usually learning more about games I've played before is exciting for me. Here I felt the opposite, despite how much it tries to add more variables to the equation. But I don't play Persona 1 for the gameplay, I play for the story! Okay, fine. Just to throw you a bone, I'm gonna completely ignore the fact that playing the game is the whole point of it being a game and focus entirely on the story. I do like how the game kicks off with a ritual in a dark, empty classroom. It's a classic setup. The main cast is testing out a rumor about a ritual called the Persona game. Supposedly, this will allow the participants to see the future or something. Also, let the record be shown that the Persona series literally starts on a bunch of kids playing Persona. It seems even all the way back then, people like to argue over these games too. Something worth noting here is that half the people in this room have already played the game and are just trying to demonstrate it to the rest of the group. You do get a pretty good demonstration of everyone's personalities here, but unfortunately, they don't really evolve much past here aside from maybe one character, which I will get into later when I talk more about the characters. You get struck by lightning and are approached by a mysterious masked man named Philemon in your dreams. Impressed with your ability to recall your name in his realm, which normally isn't easy for most people apparently, he grants you the power of Persona. You wake up in the nurse's office and are advised by your teacher to get a checkup at the hospital. While you're there, you decide to visit your friend Maki, who is chronically ill and has been hospitalized for over a year. During your visit, Maki has a breakdown and is taken to the ICU. Shortly after she's taken in, the hospital changes shape, cutting off anyone from reaching Maki, and the town of Mikagecho is attacked by demons. In the heat of the moment, you and your friends awaken to your Persona powers, and gain the ability to fight against the demons. You find Maki's mom, who states that the head of Sebek, Kandori, is behind the appearance of demons, and is developing a reality-bending machine called the Deva system. You take her back to your school where it's safe, and at this point the story can branch off into two different paths. We'll cover the common route first. The main story has you pursuing Sebek alongside Nanjo, Mark, and a healthy Maki who appears out of nowhere. This Maki has no recollection of the past year or ever being hospitalized. You sneak into Sebek, find their secret laboratory, and get sent to an alternate universe upon trying to stop Kandori's Deva system. You also find out that another student named Reiji was also trapped here and has a vendetta against Kandori too. So now you must explore and investigate this strange new world, find Kandori, and find a way back to your world. The alternate story has you investigating the rumor of the Snow Queen mask, and accidentally unleashing an evil spirit who possesses your teacher, freezes over and transforms the school into her ice castle. It's up to you, Yukino, and Ayase to conquer the 3 towers, save your teacher, and free the school from the Snow Queen's icy clutches. Not a bad premise for either scenario really. Where the game really falls short is the characters. Except one. The Sebek story basically revolves around one central character. Oh, you thought I meant the protagonist? Hell no, it's Maki. Throughout the Sebek route, you'll notice many oddities, such as the lack of police, or the Sebek building not yet existing, instead having the rumored haunted mansion that used to be there in its place. That's because this world isn't necessarily a parallel universe. It's actually a fantasy world created by the real Maki based on her memory of the city and her standards of paradise. This explains the lack of police. Based. But it also has other interesting effects such as drawing in Maki's friends from the real world, instead of creating fabricated ones. It wouldn't be paradise without her real friends there, after all. All of this being caused by Maki's mind coincidentally syncing itself with the Deva system. How? Well, if I knew, I'd tell you. This caught Kandori's attention, coaxing him to kidnap Maki from the hospital and use the world within her mind to his advantage. So in addition to the ideal Maki who you've journeyed with the whole game, there's also a malevolent aspect, Aki, and Mai. The good one, I guess. You see, the game is less about saving the world and really more about Maki's journey within herself. Even after Kandori is defeated, it's Aki who attempts to make contact with Pandora and unleash pandemonium on the world. It's Maki's resentment towards her peers living the normal life she dreamed of having that ended up being the catalyst for everything. Ultimately though, it really all just came down to whether or not Maki could learn to look inward, except that she may have those types of bad thoughts, but that doesn't make her a bad person per se. and also learn that she can't spend the rest of her life feeling sorry for herself. Sure, life may deal you an unfair hand, and it's not your fault at all, but ultimately, there is zero chance of things ever getting better unless you take things into your own hands, or at the very least, start having a better outlook on life. It might be less of an inconvenience to take the less than optimal way out. It might even just be easier to give up and escape your life entirely, but you have to fight for the outcome you want. Maki's journey is a genuinely good parable for life. If we were to leave it at that, I'd have no complaints about it. Unfortunately, this is the part where I talk about the other characters now. The protagonist is debatably even more of a self-insert than the ones of the modern games. In pretty much all of the games after Persona 1, the dialogue choices and even something as subtle as idle animations can give you small hints of personality. The Persona 1 protagonist is left as vague as possible. The choices you make as the protagonist are very straightforward moral questions. Even when you encounter the shadow of the protagonist, the most you get out of him is that you've stuck to your guns. Picking the choices you're supposed to pick only seem to imply that you're just a guy trying to find yourself in this world. But like, that's literally everyone. They really want to stress that this guy is literally you. Even at the end of the game, where they tell you where all the characters end up in life, when they get to the protagonist, they simply say, "I don't know, man, you decide." I guess for me personally, I like the small tidbits of flavor they added to later protagonists. It makes them more relatable for their respective crowds. I know people who relate to the Persona 4 protag the way I relate to Persona 3's protag. And I know a lot of people who claim they're just like Joker. Even Persona 2's protagonists have a distinct aura that I think a lot of people can vibe with. For the parabolic nature of Persona 1's story, I guess Persona 1 guy's fine. Next, we'll go over the mandatory characters for each route. Nanjo is the rich kid and pragmatist of the group. Nanjo's also the smartest one in the group. He slowly pieces together the mystery of Maki's world before it's even revealed. Actually, Nanjo is the one to reveal it, with Kandori basically just confirming it. Pretty much in any tense situation, Nanjo will implore the player to pick the self-preserving option. Even upon seeing Maki's body connected to the Deva system, Nanjo sees this as an opportunity to just solve the problem right then and there, even if it kills Maki in the process. Mark basically just exists to bicker with and bounce off Nanjo. Mark very much feels like a device for Nanjo's development. It's their argument over whether to return to Maki's world or just pull the plug on the real Maki that gets Nanjo to come around and learn that owning people with facts and logic isn't always the best answer. Otherwise, Mark just kinda exists to have a crush on Maki because, well, someone's gotta show the most interest in saving her. Everyone else just kinda feels along for the ride. There are some nice moments we get with them, like how well the game demonstrates how close Nanjo is with his butler before he died within such a short amount of time, or Mark's relationship with his mom and him being proud of his graffiti art. In terms of development, Nanjo is definitely the better of the two. Mark kinda doesn't get much of any development. Yukino joins you for the opening act, then leaves your party for the rest of the game if you choose to leave the school and pursue Kandori. On the Snow Queen route, she's a permanent party member. Yukino's the big sis of the group. When your teacher Sayako gets frozen from the spirit of the mask, Yukino feels it's her duty to save Sayako. We're told that apparently Yukino used to be a delinquent but turned over a new leaf with Sayako's help. We see a little nod to this, with Yukino starting off equipped with throwing knives before even awakening to her persona.
If you don't know your anime tropes, it's a very punk girl thing to carry throwable sharp objects with you.
Ayase is not my cup of tea. Like, I get the point of her character is supposed to be that she's shallow and lives in the moment, but then learns to think more about the future. I just don't find it very interesting. It also feels kinda weird for them to focus on that angle and just completely sweep aside her lack of consideration for people's feelings. Everyone tells her she should be nicer to people, but It doesn't really go anywhere as far as I can tell. This is like how people who hate characters like Yukari and Ai Ebihara see those two characters. Alright, now to go over the characters who are completely optional. The characters I've mentioned before are mandatory for at least one of the two story paths. These next few characters are completely optional either way. Brown's a cocky little brat who really wants to be the hero and overall is just really cringy to be around. He bickers with Mark and Sebek, but that honestly feels a bit redundant since that's already Mark and Nanjo's dynamic. Oddly enough, I find that Brown fits way better in the Snow Queen route. I think it's because of the dialogue he has with the ruler of Nemesis Tower, who is even more conceited than him. Also, his nickname is Brown because he pooped himself in middle school. I'm not joking, that's the actual reason the game states. Mark's actual name is Masao, Brown's actual name is Hidehiko. And honestly, I'm not even sure why the nicknames are there. The characters usually don't refer to each other by those names anyway. There's nothing else to his character, he's literally just a dork. Next is Eriko, or Ellie. She also fits into either route pretty well because she joins you for a short time at the beginning, and finding her again after the route lock doesn't take long at all. She models, but that won't really become relevant until Persona 2. Having an interest in the occult, Eriko is often exhilarated by supernatural situations, and shares trivia about demons you encounter throughout the game. Overall, just a joy to be around, probably my favorite of the optional characters. Just kinda wish he got more development. Finally, we have Reiji. This character is only in the Sebek route. He's the half-brother of Kandori. Reiji's mother was tossed aside by their father, and Reiji now directs all of his hatred towards Kandori. He was originally sent into Limbo by the Deva system, but was saved by Mai and taken to Maki's world. Regardless of whether he joins the party or not, he will pursue Kandori. You'd think a character with such a close tie to the villain would be a required party member, or at least easier to recruit than the rest, but no. Reiji's the secret party member of this game. Yeah, remember when games still had secret characters? The steps you need to take to recruit him are really convoluted. You can't just keep an open party slot until you meet him in the other world, because otherwise Ayase will force herself into your party as soon as you enter Sebek. You have to talk to very specific NPCs, trigger certain events where you run into him before entering Sebek, and for the love of God, only talk to his mother once. If you talk to her again, the entire process is null and void. I don't know why that's even a thing. His arc is nothing revolutionary. He's a standoffish guy and only really cares about killing Kandori with his own two hands. He doesn't really start opening up until near the end of the game, and once he does kill Kandori, he still doesn't really feel any better at all. Speaking of which, it's time to talk about Kandori. I think he kinda sucks. He barely has a presence throughout the game. The most interesting thing you learn about him at the beginning of the game is that he and Nanjo know each other, because obviously all rich people know each other. For the rest of the game, he does nothing. I get that some villains think they're too important to get their hands dirty and send their henchmen for everything, but even those types of villains at least appear throughout the story. You'd see the top honcho coming up with some devious plan, and then sending the henchmen after the main cast. But no, we're just left in the dark until literally the last minute. Guy wants to become God, Guy becomes God, then brainwashes people into regurgitating his nihilistic propaganda because actually, he himself has become jaded. He now has everything he could ever want in life and now has no purpose. Didn't think that one through, did you, buddy? It feels like they just jumped to the conclusion and skipped any and all character development. Hell, I think Reiji drives Kandori's point across better than Kandori. Reiji spent the entire game wanting to kill this man, and when he finally got what he wanted, he says it feels empty. Reiji achieved his only goal in life and now has nothing. In fact, without Reiji, Kandori and what he represents holds no weight to the player. and most people aren't even going to have Reiji in their party in their first playthrough, given how convoluted it is to even acquire him. The story was never really about defeating Kandori. He was just the red herring. It was really about Maki's introspection. Oh yeah, Kandori also appears as his younger self alongside Maki in the Snow Queen route, but they do nothing. They appear, they merge with the final boss, and then disappear afterwards. Now's about a good time to get into Snow Queen. I think this route is much better than the common route, not just in its gameplay structure, but also in its story, which is largely just tied to its antagonist. This whole scenario kicked off because of a cursed mask in a play that used to be performed regularly at your school. Every person who has worn the Snow Queen's mask has died. Each lord of each tower you climb was a victim of the mask with their own backstory. The most sympathetic villain is Kumi, the lord of Hypnos Tower. Her whole dealio is that she's pulled from all sides by her responsibilities. Everyone is just kind of a dick to her. Her classmates don't understand the concept of having strict parents, and her dad is just an ass. Guy literally insinuates that giving up drinking, smoking, and golfing on weekends wasn't worth it if Kumi doesn't stay #1 in her class, and no lower. She ranked 3rd. She only felt safe in her dreams, so the gimmick of Hypnos Tower is that you can enter the dream world to wake her up and your friends. Look, obviously I'm not saying Kumi is at all justified in forcing people to sleep and trapping them in their dreams, but I think everyone is just unnecessarily harsh to her. Even after literally seeing things from her shoes, they didn't show a shred of sympathy. I don't know, maybe it's just because I got lectured about my grades a lot growing up, whether they were pretty good or not, and trust me, there were times when they definitely were not. I just felt really angry at seeing a top student contender get shit for being #3. Like, I get what they were trying to say to her. You gotta work through your problems in spite of the shit people might give you, and you can't hide from reality. She didn't exactly put in her best effort to stick up for herself. They just did a really, really bad job at it. Absolutely no tact. I hate it. It feels like the writers were trying to rush their point across. The ruler of Nemesis Tower, on the other hand, is the least sympathetic villain. I'm not even too sure what the point of this one was. Michiko used her wealth to keep her grades at an acceptable level and literally enjoys making people suffer, then cries when she doesn't get what she wants. This tower was less about the villain and more about whether the player cares more about their friend's suffering than shooting for their long-term goal. The game tries to bait you into taking the long route with the promise of a mirror shard and a hint about the boss. The hint about the boss is just that the longer you take, the stronger she gets. The shorter route helps you get to the boss faster, and you can actually get 2 mirror shards and fight a weaker version of the boss. The villain of Thanatos Tower, Yuriko, was obsessed with her beauty to the point where she feared growing old and losing it. They also try to tie some Ayase character development to this, but as established earlier, I don't find it interesting. The main takeaway from this antagonist is that life is full of beautiful things. Some of them won't last forever, but that shouldn't make you fear the future, as there will always be wonders in life to experience and look forward to. Yuriko's mistake was allowing herself to be tempted by the Snow Queen, and embracing death so she would never die old and decrepit. She ended her life after she felt she peaked, and deprived herself of experiencing the other joys and aspirations other people might have in life. Finally, we have the Snow Queen herself, the spirit inside the mask. Only by collecting a minimum of 8 mirror shards can you get the good ending, and get the full story. Otherwise, you get a bad ending where the world ends. If you're wondering about the Sebek route's bad ending, it basically just ends after beating Kandori and is contingent on 1 dialogue exchange. I can't be bothered to get into specifics right now because this script is already getting too long, and I promised myself I wouldn't make another 2-hour-long video unless it was on something I really liked. If you want to hear more about these bad endings, you'll just have to watch my bad endings video. So the spirit possessing the Snow Queen mask was actually Tomomi, the classmate of Ms. Sayako. They were both trying for the role of Snow Queen, but the role was given to Tomomi. At least that's what we thought at first. It turns out Sayako backed out of the role so Tomomi could have it. The other drama members start spreading rumors that Sayako wanted to avoid the curse of the mask and just handed it off to her. In reality though, Sayako was just trying to do a nice thing for her friend, although she admits that deep down she might have just been virtue signaling. The mask burned Tomomi's face, and she had since held this grudge. Revealing her reflection in the demon mirror purges Tomomi's evil persona from her, and Tomomi is able to pass on along with the rest of the mask's victims. Tomomi's persona, who goes by 3 different names, we'll just call her the Night Queen, goes off to try and shroud the world in eternal night. Then you stop her. Hooray. Overall, I think the presence of multiple villains with their own motivations throughout the Snow Queen route is handled better than the one singular villain in Sebek who barely appears. Snow Queen villains aren't anything revolutionary, especially Michiko, the worst one, but surprisingly well thought out for a bunch of one-offs. As for the rest of the cast as a whole, a lot of them just feel like they're there to occupy space, as opposed to using them to tell a meaningful story or serve the overall narrative. Most of that seems to fall onto Maki. I think the real purpose of this cast was mainly to facilitate the focus on high school. The Japanese audience was apparently very receptive to the high school setting of S&T If, and Atlus wanted to capitalize on that with the Persona series. I mean, high school is something that everyone is kind of forced to experience, so it is the de facto most relatable for most people. And really, I think people just hate kids a little too much at times. If anything, it's teenagers who need to see these kinds of stories and learn these kinds of lessons for their own maturity. They need the personal growth a lot more. What's more, just because something's made for kids doesn't mean adults can't enjoy it or get anything out of it. You can tell mature stories with mature themes without an adult cast. Lastly, and most importantly, a franchise is not at all obligated to grow up with you. I'm all for a game exploring an adult cast, or the spin-off showing the characters of a previous game X years later. I just don't think it needs to be such a high priority like a good chunk of the fans think. You could have a cast of elderly people or characters of varying ages. I really don't care. It's the story you tell with these characters that matters. That doesn't make the Persona 1 cast good, but I'm not gonna sit on my ass here saying they would have been better if they were adults. Okay, I've said way more about this game than I initially thought I would, so I better wrap this up while I can. I'll be honest, I first played Persona 1 right after Persona 5 Royal. I actually enjoyed it quite a bit on my first go around. Maybe at the time I was just kind of burned out on the modern Persona formula. Persona 5 felt like kinda the same song and dance, and I just wanted something different. Persona 1 was a really magical experience, getting to witness the origins of the series. A few years later, here I am now. I came back into this game pretty optimistically. Unfortunately, I just don't enjoy it as much as I used to. It lost a lot of its magic upon replaying. And yet, I still think Persona 1 is worth your time, even if it is just for that first time experience. I still don't think this game is as bad as people say it is. I just don't really agree with the narrative that the old Persona games were darker and more mature than the newer ones, or that the story and characters were better. That is just straight up cap. Persona 1 has a lot of interesting concepts, but I feel as though they're not explored as comprehensively as future games would explore theirs. That doesn't mean Persona 1 should be forgotten though. Sure, there's a lot of unnecessary fat in this short sub-20-hour RPG, but it doesn't overstay its welcome. Despite all the criticism I gave this game, I still can't find it in me to hate it. It's overhated, but not underrated, and I don't regret playing even a second of it. Every great series has its awkward, humble beginnings, and Persona is no exception. It came off on a rough start, but a commendable effort, and I'm confident that it can only get better from here on out. Right? Hey, thanks for making it to the end of the video. I know it was a long one. I usually like to shove this somewhere in the middle of the video, but I couldn't be bothered to think of a clever segue or break up the pacing of the video. A lot of people just end up skipping it anyway. I just want to give a huge thanks to my patrons. Your support means a lot to me. I mean it. More than you could ever imagine. If you love these videos, consider checking out my Patreon. More support is more assurance that these projects are worth investing more of my time into rather than pushing it off again and again and again. Also, my day job has been kind of consuming a lot of my time and draining a lot of my energy away from making these videos. Nonetheless, I absolutely want to make videos on Persona 2 and Persona 5 at some point for the sake of giving you a full, clear image of where I stand on these games. That's all I really wanted to share. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully, I'll see you soon.